Hi, everybody. What I want to present to you is a very short video lecture on early Native Americans. And sort of the intent of this is because we're not going to have a lot of time to talk to each other in class. What I'm asking you to do is just watch this video. You don't really need to do anything other than just watch it and consider some of the questions. In your book, it doesn't have a lot of information on Native populations, so this is meant to kind of supplement that. But there's a few things that we think about when we talk about early Native Americans in North America. Number one, who were these people, right? And prior to their, who were the people that were here prior to the arrival of Europeans? Because that's going to follow Native Americans and going to be sort of the ancestors of really early, what we call European or Americans that established the United States. How did their environment shape their culture? How were Native Americans affected by Europeans? That's really important. And then what happened eventually to many of these tribes as we see North America is explored, and then these non-natives, these Europeans primarily, come into the continent. So the general theory in how North America is populated comes from two different groups of thought. One is that people came from Asia, originally probably from Africa, the African continent, and over thousands of years, if you look at the screen here where my cursor is, the oceans were much lower several thousand years ago. So the general thought is that they walked across essentially what is a land bridge that we know as the Bering Strait here, where Alaska actually connected to Asia in what is the present country of Russia. So the general theory is they walked across this ice sheet, and they came across, and they would migrate down south, following herds of animals like bison and mammoth for their food source. So most of North America, thousands of years ago, was covered with ice. And as time goes on, the planet's warming up, the ice is being pushed back here, and people are walking, and they're starting to have generations of different people whose origin story really starts in Africa and Asia. So when we think about native populations, that's sort of the story. That's the general held idea that they crossed through the land bridge. There's another theory, I guess you could say, from an anthropological perspective, where they came across on canoes, like reed boats from Micronesia through the islands in the Pacific, and then they sort of island hopped across the Pacific to eventually populate what is present-day Mesoamerica, Baja California, in the Southwest. So that's another theory. I think most academics would probably say that the general, most highly accepted theory is that they crossed through this land bridge here in what is Alaska today and then migrated down over many generations. Okay. You can see that North America, is kind of an odd shape. It's much colder in the northern part of this continent, what is in present-day Canada, than it is in the south, where we see Mesoamerica here, the Southwest, and certainly California. So the equator runs along this area here where my cursor is going. So the equator tends to be a little closer to the sun because of the positioning of the planet. And if you think back to 7th grade, or maybe even 6th grade, your science class, that as the planet rotates, it's warmer along the equator. So people tended to want to go to warmer weather. And so we see this migration happening. Some cultural groups, we have lots of different Native American populations in North America. There are hundreds of them. Some of them were smaller than others. You can see a whole bunch of different names here. And some of that you might even recognize, right? Some that are maybe more famous than others, like the Pueblo tend to have a lot bigger name than, say, I don't know, there's a whole bunch up here, say than the Dogrib of the North, right? So we're not going to get into a lot of detail about these. If you ever travel along the United States, you can see names like these all over the place. The reservation system is established for native populations after Europeans arrive, where they're pushed into certain areas that may not have been native to their normal location. Understand that a lot of these tribes they didn't get along with each other. There was always an issue about resources. It wasn't about land necessarily. It was about the resources that were on the land, primarily food. So a lot of native populations would have conflict related to the need for resources. So usually when I say resources, I mean food resources in this case. And if you look at over here where the eastern part of the United States is, there's a really important name here called the Iroquois. And that's going to be a name that we'll talk about later on when we talk about what are some early influences of the American Constitution. A lot of people think that native populations, when they don't get to know them very well, they think that they were primitive, but they were far from primitive. They actually were very complex. Their family system was very complex. Their languages are very complex. They may not have had the tools level and the levels of technology that Europeans did, but socially speaking, that's family, that's language, how they interacted with each other was extremely complicated. And they had a lot of rules. In some cases, they had fairly sophisticated forms of government of their own and how they interacted with each other. So Iroquois definitely stands out here as one of those. Some background information going back to as long as about 13,000 BCE. That's before the Common Era. Not all Native Americans were hostile. Many of them were actually quite peaceful. There were some tribes that became more hostile as people started to want to come into territory that they occupied and they started to consume their resources. Certainly, the Indians or the Native Americans, I should say, that occupy what we know as the plains area here. So this area that's in this section where the Pawnee are, the Crow, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, there were lots of Native American bison that roam these plains. And as Europeans start to move to the west, they start to consume these resources. And that caused a lot of conflict between Native Americans who were basically starving to death. And they were trying to protect those resources because it was a matter of life or death for them. Contact sometimes could happen and become violent through misunderstandings, through language issues, through culture, through just customs. And so, there was conflict not just between Native Americans, but also, of course, between Europeans and Native Americans. But also there was symbiotic, as we might say, or there was relationships that developed into partnerships. And we're going to talk in this class about how some early partnerships were established by early Americans, such as the Lewis and Clark expedition between certain tribes that would pave the way for Europeans or Americans, as they would be called, to come in and occupy land without any conflict. The geographic regions oftentimes shaped the way that people interacted. So if I go back to this map again, there's a huge mountain range here called the Rocky Mountains where my cursor is. There's another one here called the Appalachian Mountains, and they tended to isolate tribes from one another. So geography becomes a barrier, right, to certain things. And when you have geography that separates people because it takes a lot of energy to cross over into certain areas, that tended to create pockets of isolation, and some tribes would not have any contact. We do know that there are some of these North American tribes that were trading actually with tribes that existed down here. And if you remember your 7th grade world history, with groups like the Maya, the Aztec, and even as far down as the Inca in Peru. So we have objects that we have found that have been traded because we know they were traded because they're not unique. They're not unique to a certain area, like certain kinds of trade goods, like obsidian, for example, which is volcanic rock. You won't find that in certain places because it doesn't exist. So we know it was brought in from somewhere else. Resources sometimes were shared through trade, but not always, and that would cause conflict. Native people were more complicated than Europeans realized, and this, even though Europeans have a sort of a superiority complex when it came to Native Americans, in many cases because Native Americans would not convert to Christianity, which was the dominant religion in Europe, they would sort of treat them separately and differently. They would consider them non-Christian or heathens, as we call them, and so they would mistreat them, they would enslave them, or they would just take advantage of them because they felt like they were superior to them. They had, in generally speaking, they had superior technology, and therefore they would treat them as sort of second-class people. We know certainly from 7th grade, if you remember, Columbus enslaved many native populations to meet his needs when he was driving to try to find gold in what is present day, essentially the southern island of Cuba and the Dominican Republic. There's a huge dilemma here, right? The European native people's dilemma is this. Native people, number one, did not believe in this idea of land ownership, and this caused conflict. So native peoples don't have fences per se. They don't have this idea that I put up a fence and then this is my land. So this caused conflict. Europeans were always about land, and they were always about land ownership. So when they came into an area and they took land, they believed it was theirs, where native people didn't have that concept of that, and that causes conflicts. Disease oftentimes was the biggest threat to Native Americans. In fact, more Native Americans will die of diseases that are brought into North America from the outside, primarily from Europe, that will cause the most tragedy among Native populations. Not shootings or conflict that way, but rather through diseases. Horses, firearms, alcohol are all brought in and introduced to Native people by Europeans, and that's going to be, horses will be a technological advantage for Native populations, so will firearms, but alcohol, not so much. Alcohol is going to have a big impact on Native people. It's going to cause a lot of social issues for them culturally, and it's going to be a huge deal. Native tribes competed and fought against each other and Europeans, just kind of cut off here, for resources. And that's sort of the dilemma between Europeans and native people of America, of what we call America today. There's a resource grab, a land grab. There's a cultural conflict. There's these barriers that get in the way, and Native populations are just not strong enough to resist the push that Europeans put on them to take land, to enslave them, and to essentially cause a lot of destruction among Native populations by diseases. Okay. Eventually, Native Americans would succumb, which means they would either accept European cultures, which would become later Americans, right? Or they would be forced onto what we know as reservations. That's land that was not very desirable for most Native people, and it was it was land that was very different than where they had started at. For example, moving somebody from a forest environment into a plains environment caused a lot of problems for them because they were not used to that kind of geography. They didn't know how to grow food. They didn't know how to find food as easily. And so that would cause many, many problems. Okay. So we're not going to do the essential question here that I have on this video. I'm going to conclude this lecture here to try to keep it short. Just kind of get an overview of some of this conflict, because we're going to talk about this later on. Okay. Thank you very much. And that, I think, is going to conclude this presentation. Yes. All right. We'll see you later.